They say the quiet ones are the ones you should watch, maybe because silence gives us space to see the cracks no one else dares to look at. When I first met Daniel, I didn't know I was about to build a life that would one day become the blueprint of my betrayal. We were both 27, standing under that cracked skylight in the university library, the one that let in sunlight like it was rationed, and he noticed I was reading the same book he'd been struggling through for his sociology class. He smiled, the kind that made you feel like you were in on a secret, and asked if I thought the author was actually making sense or just stringing together academic nonsense with big words and a thesaurus. That was our first conversation. It wasn't dramatic or romantic, but it stayed with me. Because it wasn't about impressing me, it was about seeing me. Daniel didn't just listen. He made me feel like my thoughts mattered in a world where I had spent most of my life being the emotional glue for everyone else's chaos. I had always been the one to mediate arguments, calm tempers, smooth over disasters, both large and petty. My younger sister, Ava, had a flair for theatrical breakdowns and impulsive declarations of love, rage, career pivots, and existential crises. My parents played favorites subtly, but clearly Ava the incandescent fireball of passion and promise, and me the reliable fixture in the background who never dropped the ball. I didn't drop the ball because I was never given one to run with. So when Daniel asked me to coffee the next week, not with any flamboyant pickup line, but because he wanted to debate the book's stance on structural inequality, I said yes before my usual internal voice could list all the reasons I should just stay in my lane. It wasn't love at first sight. It was something slower, deeper, and more dangerous because it didn't set off any alarms. Our relationship grew like ivy, strong, unassuming, slowly weaving into the architecture of my life until I couldn't remember the shape of it without him. We didn't rush anything. We spent months just being friends who met over coffee and talked about everything from economic policy to our favorite childhood books. I learned that he'd grown up in a strict but loving household and had always been the dependable son, the one who brought home good grades and called his grandmother every Sunday. I told him how I often felt invisible beside Ava, how even when I won academic awards or organized a charity fundraiser, it was Ava's new haircut or her latest internship in Paris that dominated family conversations. He didn't try to fix it. He just said, "I see you," and meant it. By the time we started dating, it felt like stepping into a room I'd lived beside for years, but had never dared to enter. Safe, warm, gently lit by the quiet glow of trust. We got married when we were 32. A small ceremony under a sycamore tree, with handwritten vows and a playlist we curated together over long nights filled with wine, soft jazz, and candlelight. Ava was my maid of honor. She smiled, complimented my dress, gave a speech that was just the right balance of humor and sentiment. But something in her voice, or maybe her eyes, felt just a bit off. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe not. She kissed me on the cheek after the ceremony and whispered, "He really loves you, huh?" But it didn't sound like a question. It sounded like a warning. Married life with Daniel was never flashy, never filled with grand romantic gestures or elaborate vacations. But it had something else, something rarer. We created rituals that stitched us together like thread along the seams of a worn and beloved coat. We gardened on Saturdays, our hands deep in soil, shoulders touching as we argued over what to plant next season. We hiked on Sundays, sharing trail mix and quiet observations about tree roots and weather patterns and that odd old man who always walked barefoot through the park. We cooked dinner in silence on weeknights, our movements a choreography learned over time. I chopped, he stirred, and the silence between us was never heavy. It was sacred. Ava visited often. Too often, if I'm being honest. She'd show up with stories of broken hearts and bad dates, of job offers in cities she swore she hated and dreams she'd never quite chase all the way. Daniel was always kind, always patient. Too patient, maybe. He made her tea, listened to her ramble, offered book recommendations or TED Talks that might help. She'd thank him, call him her brother-in-law therapist, and once she even joked, If Elise ever gets tired of you, I might swoop in. It was a joke, I think. I laughed, even though my stomach twisted a little. I never saw Daniel look at her in any way that crossed a line, but Ava had a way of blurring them. Her compliments lingered. Her touch, a hand on his arm or a too long hug, danced on the edge of something that didn't sit right with me. I told myself I was being paranoid. That some part of me, after years of playing second fiddle, just didn't know how to handle sharing space, even safe space, with someone like her. But still, those moments stacked like pebbles in my chest. Not heavy enough to crush, just enough to make it hard to breathe some days. Daniel never once gave me a reason to doubt him. He was present, loving. He remembered the little things, how I hated cilantro, how I cried every time we rewatched The Iron Giant, how I liked my tea with a specific honey from a local farm 2 towns over. So I built my world around him, brick by brick, with a kind of faith that only a woman who has spent her whole life doubting her own worth can understand. And maybe that was the mistake. Not the loving, not the trusting, but the assuming that the foundation we built was ours alone, that the cracks I sometimes felt beneath the surface were just echoes of old insecurities and not the beginning of something real. Something deliberate. Something that was already, quietly, breaking. They say grief sharpens everything. Colors become louder. Light cuts deeper. Sounds stab your eardrums like accusations instead of comforts. But no one tells you how disorienting it is to live in a world where the person you loved most has been reduced to past tense. And no one prepares you for the moment when public mourning becomes indistinguishable from personal humiliation. Daniel died on a Monday morning. It wasn't raining, though I wish it had been. The sky was wide open, a cold, cloudless blue, the kind of perfect clarity that makes the world feel unkind. I got the call from a nurse who sounded like she'd been trained to deliver news with a voice as smooth as marble. She didn't stutter. She didn't breathe. She just said it, like she was reading it from a card. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm so sorry. Your husband was in a car accident early this morning. He didn't survive the impact." I didn't scream. I didn't drop the phone or collapse to my knees. I just sat there in the kitchen, next to the half-sliced pear I was going to put into his lunch. The knife was still in my hand. The fruit, half-finished. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. Not for a long time. We had been planning to have lentil soup that night. That's what haunts me most, how ordinary the day was supposed to be. What followed was a blur of paperwork, condolence calls, casseroles stacked in the fridge by neighbors I hadn't seen in years. His office sent flowers, a bouquet so large it made the hallway feel like a funeral home before the actual funeral even began. The insurance company left 3 voicemails. The funeral home coordinator wore a pastel pink blazer and spoke in the clipped tone of someone who'd organized more deaths than weddings. I chose a simple dark suit for Daniel. He hated anything flashy. Even on our wedding day, he'd insisted on charcoal gray instead of black. "Black is too final," he'd said back then, smiling. "Gray means the story still has room to shift." But this story? It ended with shattered glass on asphalt and my name etched into a police report labeled next of kin. The funeral was held at a modest chapel near the edge of town, nestled between a weathered bookstore and a coffee shop where Daniel and I used to argue over whether scones were pastries or just dry biscuits with a superiority complex. I chose the venue because of the stained glass windows. He liked the way they filtered light into watercolor hues. I remember how he once told me that stained glass was proof you could shatter something and still make it beautiful. People arrived in droves. Former students, colleagues, distant relatives who hadn't bothered sending Christmas cards in years. Even my old high school English teacher showed up, wearing the same navy coat she wore to my graduation. Everyone wanted to grieve him. Everyone wanted to be part of the tragedy. And then there was Ava. She swept into the chapel like a gust of wind scented with expensive perfume and tightly coiled secrets. Her dress was too elegant, her hair too perfect, her smile rehearsed in a way that felt like she was auditioning for sympathy rather than experiencing it. She hugged me too tightly, held me a second too long. Her lips grazed my cheek with an intimacy that felt more for the audience than for me. "I got the earliest flight I could," she said, eyes glassy but dry. "I couldn't let him go without saying goodbye." I nodded. I didn't have the strength to question anything. When the service began, the minister's voice was gentle, speaking of peace and love and Daniel's contributions to the community. I stood there, hands folded tightly in front of me, trying not to shake. My whole body felt like it had been scooped out and filled with concrete. Each word echoed off the chapel walls like a verdict I didn't get to appeal. Then Ava asked to speak. I didn't expect her to, but she stood up from the pew in one fluid motion, her heels clicking like punctuation against the marble floor. She didn't ask. She just walked to the pulpit and turned to face the crowd with the poise of someone who believed the spotlight belonged to her. "I'm Ava," she began, her voice soft but deliberately clear, like she'd been practicing. "Elise's sister. Daniel's closest friend." She paused. Let the silence stretch until the room began to shift uncomfortably. I felt my stomach tighten, a cold knot winding just beneath my ribs. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything today," she continued, voice trembling, but only slightly, just enough to feel authentic. But I realized I owed it to him. She looked at me, her eyes flicking toward mine with something I couldn't place, pity or guilt or maybe just the thrill of performance. And then she dropped the bomb like it was a blessing. I loved him. He was the love of my life. A collective breath was sucked from the room. Gasps followed, some muffled murmurs. I felt the heat rise to my face, not from embarrassment, but from a fire that ignited somewhere deep in my spine. My fingers curled around the program in my lap until it crumpled into a fist-sized knot of paper and disbelief. "I know this may come as a shock," Ava continued, eyes glassy now in earnest. "But we never meant to hurt anyone. We just couldn't help what we felt." And then, without missing a beat, she added, "He would want me to say it. He wouldn't want to go into the ground with that truth buried alongside him." I didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or rush the pulpit like some humiliated soap opera widow. I sat there, every muscle in my body clenched tight like a wire about to snap. My pulse pounded in my ears so loudly that I barely heard the rest of her speech. Something about fate. Something about timing. Something about how complicated love can be. But none of it mattered. Not in that moment. Because inside my handbag, nestled between a travel-sized packet of tissues and a lipstick I hadn't used in weeks, was a sealed envelope. Daniel had left it for me. The lawyer had handed it over 3 days before the funeral, his last request, written into his will. To be opened by Elise in the event of my sudden death. That was all the outside said. I hadn't read it yet. I hadn't dared. Now, sitting in that pew, my marriage dissected under fluorescent lights and floral arrangements, I reached into my bag and pulled the envelope free. It was thick. Heavy. His handwriting on the front, unmistakable, slanted, slightly messy, the same scrawl he'd used on our anniversary cards and grocery lists. I traced my finger over the ink, over the name he'd written with a tenderness that now felt like a ghost pressing its lips to my ear. I could open it right then. I could tear it wide and read it aloud to this room full of people who had just watched my life collapse like a sandcastle in a tide. But something held me back. Because what if Ava was telling the truth? What if the man I'd loved, the man who had whispered promises into my hair during thunderstorms and traced poems onto my skin in candlelight, had been loving someone else behind the veil of our rituals? What if every "I love you" had a twin whispered into her ear in stolen moments? And worse, what if the letter proved it? Or what if the letter didn't explain anything at all? What if it was just another performance, another layer of manipulation carefully folded into cursive and regret? I slipped the envelope back into my handbag as the service concluded. I shook hands. I accepted condolences. I nodded at people whose names I couldn't remember and thanked them for their kind words. I stood beside Ava as she hugged old family friends and played the grieving sister like she'd rehearsed the role for months. When it was over, I walked to the cemetery alone. No entourage. No siblings. No fanfare. Just me and a man-shaped hole in the earth. And when I stood over the fresh dirt, the smell of soil and cut flowers clinging to the wind, I reached into my bag and pulled out the letter again. I didn't open it. Not yet. Because some truths are like glass. Once you shatter them, you can't put them back. I used to believe that betrayal wore a sharp suit and carried a blade. That it would arrive loudly, kicking through the door of your life with destruction in its wake. But now I know the real betrayals come dressed in quiet moments. They come with soft eyes and hands that have held you. They come in the handwriting of someone you once thought incapable of cruelty. After the funeral, I didn't return with anyone. There were offers, of course. Friends who tried to mask their curiosity as concern. Cousins who suddenly remembered my name. Even Ava, for all her dramatic declarations and well-timed tears, had the nerve to ask if I wanted company. I told her I needed air. I told her I needed space. What I didn't tell her was that I needed to be alone with my rage before I said something that would turn mourning into war. The house was cold when I returned. Not physically, it was June, and the sun had lingered longer than it should have, but it felt cold in the way a space does when the life has been drained from it. The silence was too complete. No hum of Daniel's music from the study. No half-finished tea on the counter. No scent of his aftershave clinging to the air. Just emptiness. I moved like someone walking through a crime scene, deliberate, careful, as though the memories might collapse if I stepped in the wrong place. I took off my shoes by the door, hung up my black coat with shaking fingers, and walked to the kitchen table where I had left the envelope. It was still there. Still whole. Still waiting to deliver a blow I wasn't sure I could survive. I sat down slowly, the wooden chair groaning beneath me, and took a deep breath that did nothing to steady my hands. The envelope was thick, the paper good quality, the kind he always used for anything he deemed important. His name was signed on the front, just my name beneath it, no date, no title. Just that, Elise. As though that alone could hold the weight of whatever waited inside. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I sat there staring at it like it might dissolve on its own. Like maybe if I waited long enough, I'd wake up and find this entire day erased like a bad dream. But reality doesn't work that way. Grief doesn't hand out second chances. And the dead don't speak unless we dare to let them. So I broke the seal. And I read, Elise, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I wish I could start this letter with love and poetry, the way I used to when I wanted to make you smile. But I can't. Not yet. There's too much I need to explain. Too much I've hidden, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear of losing the one good thing I ever built. You. Before everything that mattered, I made a mistake. One I've carried like a stone in my chest for far too long. Ava and I had an affair. It wasn't during our marriage. I need you to hear that first. It was before we were serious, back in college, when everything was chaotic and nothing made sense. It was passionate, yes, but it was also destructive. She was volatile, and I was lost. We clung to each other for all the wrong reasons. It didn't last long, maybe 3 months. But it ended badly. Violently, emotionally. She became obsessed. Possessive. It scared me. When I met you, it was like stepping out of a storm. You were light in a way I didn't understand at first. You didn't demand. You didn't unravel. You just were. And I fell. Hard. You steadied me. You made me believe in a kind of love I had never known existed. I never told you about Ava because I thought the past was dead. I believed it had no place in the life we were building. I thought I had buried it deep enough. But Ava never let go. She never really moved on. She'd pop back into our lives, you remember. Unannounced visits. Casual messages. You thought it was sisterly affection. I let you think that. I was a coward. Over the years, she dropped hints. Oblique references to old times. She'd make jokes only I would catch. And every time, I brushed it aside. I never responded to her provocations. I never engaged. But lately, it got worse. The last few months, she started reaching out again. Emails, voicemails, threatening to tell you. Telling me she still loved me. That we were never truly over. I ignored her. I deleted the messages. But the fear began to grow, not of what she might do to me, but of what she might do to you. You didn't deserve this. You still don't. But if I'm gone, if something happened to me, I needed you to know the truth. I needed you to hear it from me, not from her lips twisted with envy and regret. I loved you, Elise. I loved you in a way I didn't think was possible for a man like me. Everything I was, everything I became, was because of you. You were my peace, my home, my real. She was a mistake, a storm I never should have entered. Please don't let her rewrite our story. Please don't let her turn my memory into something rotten. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I wouldn't blame you if you couldn't. But I'm begging you to remember the truth beneath all this ruin. You were my whole life. Always. Daniel. I read it 3 times. Each word cut differently. The first read felt like a bullet. The second, like a confession from a man I no longer recognized. And the third, by the third, I began to cry. Not sobbing. Not dramatic, gasping wails. Just tears that leaked out like blood from a wound I hadn't realized had been opened. The kind of crying you can't stop because it's not about sorrow. It's about understanding. It's about realizing that the man you built a life with had compartments in his heart you were never given the key to. He didn't cheat on me. Not technically. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that he lied. What mattered was that he let Ava wrap herself around our lives like a vine, creeping and uninvited. He let her linger in our sacred spaces. In our Sunday hikes. In our kitchen where I had cooked for her. In our living room where she had laughed too loudly at his jokes. He let her live in the walls of our marriage. And I let her in too. I welcomed her. I smiled. I shared my husband with her in plain sight, never knowing that every glance, every inside joke, every awkward silence was a piece of a puzzle I didn't know I was building. I felt like a fool. But more than that, I felt gutted. Because somewhere in all of this, I still loved him. Still loved the man who danced with me barefoot on rainy nights. Still loved the man who cried when we lost our first pregnancy and held me so tightly I thought we might fuse into one person. Still loved the man who picked dandelions for our anniversary one year because he said expensive flowers couldn't compete with something that dared to grow wild. But now, even those memories felt tainted. Not ruined. Just infected. Like the core of something I thought was whole had quietly rotted, and I was only now seeing the decay. I folded the letter slowly. My hands were shaking again. I didn't tear it up. I didn't throw it in the fire. I placed it back in the envelope and set it on the mantel beside the photo of us taken in Italy, our 5th anniversary. He had kissed my shoulder just before the camera snapped. I had smiled like I had everything I ever wanted. Maybe I had. Maybe that's what made this so cruel. I stayed there for hours, the house silent around me, the letter burning in my mind like a brand. I didn't know what I was supposed to do next. Forgive him? Hate her? Rebuild myself? All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. And maybe that's where the real betrayal lives, not in the lie itself, but in the life that can no longer be trusted. There's a particular kind of silence that settles after grief has finished burning through the walls of your life. It isn't peaceful, and it certainly isn't comforting. It's surgical, precise. A silence that slices you cleanly in half, revealing the raw architecture of who you are when everything you thought you needed has been torn away. I sat in that silence for hours after reading Daniel's letter, staring at the floor like it might offer me answers the man I loved never had the courage to say aloud. By morning, the world outside my windows had dared to continue without him. A child rode past on a rusted bicycle. Someone mowed a lawn 2 doors down. The bakery on the corner released the scent of cinnamon into the breeze like nothing had happened. But something had. Everything had. And I couldn't pretend otherwise. I made the tea myself, loose leaf, not bagged, because Ava always insisted the difference was a matter of dignity. I wondered if she'd say the same now, with Daniel's ghost still echoing through the halls of this house. I set the table as I always had, porcelain cups with pale gold rims, the ones we used only for guests. Ava didn't deserve them, but this was about control, not reward. She arrived just after noon, fashionably late, as if she had somewhere better to be. She stepped into the doorway wearing sunglasses far too large for a day without sun, her lips painted a shade of red that suggested she was still performing for someone, anyone, who might be watching. I didn't hug her. I didn't speak. I only nodded toward the kitchen and walked ahead, trusting she would follow. She did. We sat across from each other at the small round table near the bay window. The same table where Daniel and I used to read the newspaper together on Sundays. The same table where Ava had once laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny. I poured the tea. She watched me do it. So, she said, voice brittle around the edges. You wanted to talk. I read the letter, I said, and her hands flinched just slightly, just enough. There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Not quite fear. Not quite regret. Something murkier. A cocktail of emotions that didn't know whether to apologize or double down. Elise, she began, and I stopped her with a raised hand. Calm. Controlled. Measured like a blade. Don't explain, I said softly. Not yet. I want to hear your version first. She exhaled slowly, like she'd rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times, waiting for the chance to be seen not as the villain, but as the wounded heroine in a love story that no one would validate. It wasn't what you think, she said, and her voice had that brittle quiver she used to summon as a child whenever she broke something and didn't want to get in trouble. It wasn't an affair. It was before. Before you and Daniel were serious. Before there were vows. Before there was a home. I let her speak. We were drawn to each other, she said, the words sticking in her throat like a poorly swallowed pill. I won't lie and say it wasn't intense. But it was also short-lived. We were fire, Elise. And fire doesn't last. He couldn't handle it. Said it was too much. Said I was too much. Her hands curled around the cup like it might keep her from unraveling. He pulled away, she said, softer now. And then he met you. And suddenly everything I was, everything we had, became something he wanted to erase. I didn't try to ruin your marriage. I didn't even try to win him back. I never got closure. I was left in that space between fury and grief, and you, she pointed slightly, not accusing, but broken, you got to live the life I thought we might have had. I watched you build it. I smiled. I came to your wedding. I watched you carry his last name like it had always belonged to you. I waited until she stopped talking. Waited until the silence stretched long enough to make her uncomfortable. Then I picked up my cup, took a sip, and set it down without breaking eye contact. You weren't the love of his life, Ava, I said, and my voice was not loud, not angry, but laced with something sharper than either truth. She froze. You were the reason he feared being honest with me, I continued, each word deliberate, heavy, unshakable. You were the weight he carried in his silence. You weren't a memory. You were a warning. A regret. You haunted him, and now you want to haunt me. Her face crumbled slightly, not entirely. She still wore her armor, but it cracked in the corners, like glass pretending to be whole. Elise, I didn't mean to. To what? I interrupted, tilting my head slightly. To make my husband write a letter from the grave begging me not to believe you? To speak at his funeral and make yourself the headline of someone else's obituary? What exactly didn't you mean to do? She looked away, her chin trembling. I was in pain, she whispered, and for a moment, I believed her. I know, I said. But pain doesn't excuse cruelty. And it doesn't give you permission to rewrite the life I built with him because yours never had the chance to begin. The clock ticked loudly in the next room. The kind of ticking that usually faded into the background, but today felt like a metronome counting down to something final. "I'm not going to scream at you," I said. "I'm not going to throw anything or tell our family what you did. I won't ruin what little dignity Daniel tried to leave behind. But I won't protect your version of the story either." Ava swallowed hard. "I forgive you," I said, and her eyes snapped back to mine. "But forgiveness doesn't mean invitation. It doesn't mean I want you in my life. Not now. Not for a long time. Maybe not ever." She opened her mouth, but I raised my hand again. "I need to rebuild something," I said. "And you can't be part of that foundation. I'm sorry if that hurts. But I've been bleeding for days, and I'm just now realizing how deep the cuts go. Some of them were yours." Ava stood. She didn't say another word. She just nodded, her face unreadable, her eyes gleaming with something too complex to name. She walked to the door slowly, like someone exiting a battlefield they never meant to enter. She didn't look back. When the door closed behind her, the silence returned, but it was a different kind this time. Not surgical. Not punishing. Just clean. I poured the rest of the tea down the sink. I washed the cups. I folded the napkins. And then I sat back down at the table alone, where Daniel used to sit, and whispered something into the air that he would never hear. "I still love you," I said. "But I won't carry your ghosts anymore." And then I let them go. Grief does not end with a single decision. It does not retreat simply because you've declared war against it or begged it to loosen its grip. It lingers like fog, not dense enough to blind you completely, but heavy enough to slow your steps and make you question every path forward. In the months following Daniel's funeral, I learned that healing is not a staircase or a finish line. It is a long, uneven road with detours no one warns you about. I began writing letters. Not to send them, not to share them, and certainly not for the sake of closure, because that word has always felt dishonest. These letters were private and deliberate. My handwriting, my voice, my pain given shape on the page. I wrote to Daniel first, mostly at night when the silence of the house made me feel like he might still be listening from somewhere just beyond reach. "Dear Daniel," I began on the first Tuesday in September, when the garden was still clinging to its late summer bloom and the kitchen still smelled faintly of chamomile from a pot I hadn't yet washed. "I'm angry with you. And I miss you. I hate that those two things can exist in the same breath, but they do. You should have told me. But more than that, you should have trusted me to survive the truth. I would have forgiven you. Not because I'm weak, but because you were worth forgiving. I wish I could tell you that in person, but this will have to do." I didn't read the letter after I wrote it. I folded it once, carefully, and placed it in the wooden box on my bedside table, the one he carved for me years ago during a particularly cold winter when we were both too broke for gifts and too in love to care. Over time, more letters joined the first one. Some were sharp, others soft. Some held love, others held grief in its rawest form. Eventually, I wrote one to Ava. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't a weapon. But it was honest. I told her I didn't hate her anymore, though I had for a while. I told her I understood the ache of being left behind, the unbearable intimacy of knowing someone had moved on from you and chosen someone else, permanently. I told her that none of it gave her the right to dismantle a memory that wasn't hers to touch. And I told her I hoped, someday, she would build something real for herself instead of lingering in the ruins of what she once wanted. I never sent it. But just writing it loosened something in my chest that had been knotted for too long. My world did not reshape overnight. There were no grand epiphanies, no sunrise moments where everything suddenly felt beautiful again. But there were small choices, deliberate shifts that helped me feel my way back into my own skin. I started with the garden. It was the same patch of soil where Daniel and I had once argued over whether tomatoes needed more sun or less. He had built the wooden raised beds with his bare hands, insisting it would help with the drainage. I'd always found comfort in the act of tending, even when life around me was coming undone. But now it felt like too much, a museum of our togetherness. So I changed it. I dug up the old lavender that had outgrown its corner. I planted foxgloves and black-eyed Susans. I added a small stone bench near the edge of the rosemary bush, not because Daniel would have liked it, but because I did. I reclaimed the space as mine without needing to erase him from it entirely. There was strength in that balance. A quiet revolution in choosing myself without dishonoring what had been. I donated his clothes next. It took me 3 weeks to gather the courage to open the closet and start folding. Not because I couldn't let go of the fabric, but because the scent of him still clung to the collars and cuffs like memory's last breath. I kept one sweater, an old, soft gray one he wore every Sunday morning when we read on the porch. Everything else I gave away. Someone else would wear them now. Someone else would give them new stories. That thought didn't hurt as much as I thought it would. I joined a grief support group 2 towns over. I didn't speak for the first 2 meetings. I just listened. There were widows, children, men who had lost parents they hadn't spoken to in years. One woman, Cheryl, lost her husband to cancer 6 months after their wedding. Another, Naomi, had lost both parents in a fire. No one tried to make the pain prettier. No one offered cliches. We just sat in the circle, week after week, and breathed in the truth that loss changes us all, and no one escapes unscathed. It became my new ritual. Once a week, I'd drive there in silence, listen, sometimes cry, sometimes laugh, and then come home with just a little more space inside me for living. Then, in late October, I received a package. There was no note on the outside, no return address, I recognized. But the handwriting on the front was unmistakable. I opened it slowly, bracing for whatever it might contain. Inside, wrapped in soft linen, was a photograph. Old, faded at the corners. It was of the 3 of us, me, Daniel, and Ava, taken years ago during a picnic at the lake. Daniel had his arm around both of us. I was laughing. Ava was mid-sentence. We looked young, whole, unbroken. Underneath the photo, there was a letter. Elise, it began. There's no defense for what I did. There are explanations, but they don't excuse anything. I know now that what I called love was more obsession than affection, more possession than partnership. I wanted Daniel because he was safe, because he reminded me of the version of myself I could never fully become. When he chose you, I blamed you for taking something that was never really mine. That wasn't fair. What I did at the funeral, what I said, was not an act of grief. It was desperation. I needed to matter. I needed to be acknowledged. And I hurt you to satisfy that need. I see that now. And I am sorry. Not for the past we shared, because that was real to me, but for trying to write myself into your story without your permission. You were always the stronger one. Even when we were children, even when you tried to keep the peace between mom's moods and dad's distance. I envied that strength. I still do. I won't contact you again unless you wish it. I wanted you to have this photo not to remind you of pain, but to remember that we were once something else. That before all of this, we were just 2 sisters trying to find ourselves. Forgive me if you can. But even if you can't, I'll understand. Ava. I sat with the letter in my lap for nearly an hour. The photograph trembled slightly between my fingers. I wasn't sure what moved me more, the words, or the fact that she finally understood what she had done. I didn't write back. Not right away. Not because I hadn't forgiven her, but because I had nothing more to say that she hadn't already guessed. Instead, I placed the photo on my desk beside my journals, not as a symbol of forgiveness, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the past existed and that I no longer needed to be afraid of it. That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen window and brewed a pot of tea. I drank it alone, in silence, watching the shadows flicker on the walls of the house that had once been ours and was now fully mine. The pain hadn't vanished. It never would. But it had changed shape. And I had changed with it.